I think the very idea that someone who is not affiliated with WikiLeaks in any way can give a talk about its future suggests that it's more than just a simple organization or a group of people united by a common goal. And I think it will be very hard to imagine me pontificating about the future of Human Rights Watch or, ExxonMobil. So I think the good way and the most appropriate way to think about WikiLeaks is probably as a social movement. I first got to know them in 2008 when I ran into a workshop that WikiLeaks was organizing at a conference for bloggers in Budapest. And I've been watching them for several years now. And I think as someone who has spent quite some time tracking their evolution, I think the thing that strikes me the most is just how quickly and rapidly they evolve. I mean, if you look at the very early stage of WikiLeaks, you'll see that they were driven by a mix of what I call cyber-utopianism and political romanticism, where they thought that putting information online is enough, and hence the wiki in their name. They really thought that publishing documents on the internet will lead to more people getting interested in social problems and trying to address them and campaign on them and write journalistic pieces about them. And I think over the years, and you can see it in some of the interviews that Julian Assange has been given recently, you actually see how disappointed they were in this initial approach, where they thought that they can just copy the model of Wikipedia and people will show up on their site and start working for free and start campaigning on corruption in Russia or abuses of power in Africa. Of course, none of that has happened, and I think the kind of model they have embraced now with them working very closely with their partners in the media, working very closely with various NGOs, working very closely with people who have very little to do with computers, so computer security in general, I think is probably the right way for WikiLeaks to evolve. The question that has intrigued me the most, as I have been watching the American reaction to what has happened to WikiLeaks, is that it's not really questions of transparency and government secrecy that WikiLeaks has highlighted. It's the question that highlighted the most, I must say. Of course, they have highlighted the others. It's really the questions of internet architecture and the way in which modern internet operates that I think really came to everyone's attention and really made a lot of people involved with computers and the internet, a lot of geeks, radically rethink the future of the internet. And here I think we need, those of you who haven't followed the story closely in the US, you probably need to remember that WikiLeaks was a victim of cyber attacks on the day on which they decided to release the cables. Amazon dropped them off their servers. Companies like PayPal, MasterCard, Visa Card refused to do business with them. The company that provided their domain name eventually dropped them. So everything that could only go wrong with an internet venture of any kind has happened to them, except for having Twitter and Facebook, their two main communication vehicles, in addition to their website, actually refusing to drop WikiLeaks and allowing them to continue communicating by using Twitter and Facebook. And you should not underestimate the power of those two platforms, in part because there are, I think, more than 500,000 people who follow WikiLeaks on Twitter. So for them, it's a huge and very important vehicle for outreach. And I think what has happened, as many geeks and internet savvy people, as they watched what happened to WikiLeaks in the first week after they published the cables, I think they got to realize that there is something fundamentally wrong with internet architecture and with the way in which it's owned and controlled, not just by private companies, but by American companies who are subject to pressure from American government. So the most interesting thing that to have come out of WikiLeaks, from my perspective, is this new emerging movement of extremely politicized geeks who are working on several projects that seem to minimize the kind of damage that was done to WikiLeaks. And by that I mean providing systems for decentralized hosting. So it would not be easy for a company like Amazon to basically drop you as a client when you want to host a website. Providing a new way to build domain name management system. So your website, wikileaks.org, would not suddenly disappear or turn into a string of numbers, your IP address. It's providing a new decentralized payment system so that, as an entity, you would be able to raise money outside of the corporate banking system controlled by PayPal, Visa card, and MasterCard. And all of those efforts, and there are some interesting projects called Unhosted, there is another one called Bitcoin, there are many that if you look online, you'll actually see that have either emerged because of what has happened to WikiLeaks, or they were significantly boosted. And I think it's very important to have this political movement that is emerging around the future of the internet in mind when we think about the impact that the WikiLeaks affair has had on the world. The most interesting bit there is that this movement is also now aligning themselves with other political movements in Europe. The Pirate Party, for example, which is a very interesting emerging political force which is campaigning in many European parliaments, and actually in the European Parliament itself, on issues of copyright reform and on issues of intellectual property reform. And the alignment between the WikiLeaks social movement and the Pirate Party social movement, I think, is very important because it may politicize the web and politicize technology to a similar extent that the Green movement managed to politicize the matters of environment in the 60s and the 70s. And I think the emergence of that movement, to me, is a very interesting development to come out of the WikiLeaks affair. And the question then, of course, is where does it leave WikiLeaks itself, and where does it leave Julian Assange? Looking at the future of WikiLeaks, the organization, as opposed to WikiLeaks, the social movement, I think we need to be very careful in understanding what value WikiLeaks as an organization adds to the leaking process. And I think at this point, I've thought really hard about it, and I think the value that they add is twofold. First of all, it's providing secure technology for anonymous leaking. So anyone who wants to upload a document anonymously to their website would be able to do it, and it will be very hard to trace that person, unless that person discloses that he did so voluntarily, as seems to have happened with Private Manning. The other, I think, aspect that WikiLeaks adds, which is probably more important than the leaking technology, is their network. It's their ability not just to receive data, but to actually analyze what should be done about the data. What kind of journalists should say it? What kind of media outlets should be asked to process it? What kind of NGOs should be invited to campaign on the issues highlighted by the data? And it's that network that is emerging around WikiLeaks that I think is what makes WikiLeaks so valuable. The problem with this model, where WikiLeaks has a very strong brand and has the network, which it can exploit, and it can definitely exploit for its profit and for its brand, is that it pushes WikiLeaks towards a much more professional NGO-like model, where they will need to have full-time trained analysts who will be much like analysts who process data in Human Rights Watch, who would be sitting at their desks, looking at the incoming documents and deciding what to do about them. At this point, I'm not sure that this extremely boring model, from the perspective of hackers around WikiLeaks and Julian Assange, is something that they would like to morph into. It would be, I think, an interesting development, but we should also, I think, be aware of the fact that it will also make many of the processes that make WikiLeaks so exciting much more routine and much less romantic. I'm not sure to what extent such an entity would be able to function profiting from the kind of geek allure that they have been profiting from until now. That said, I think we should also consider the question of what happens to numerous clones that have emerged around WikiLeaks. Right now we have a website called OpenLeaks started by Assange's former partner, which aims to do something very similar to WikiLeaks, but be extremely transparent about their methods. This will probably be WikiLeaks' main competitor, and it's a question that I think is very hard to answer at this point, whether internal secrecy is harmful or actually beneficial to an entity like WikiLeaks. And OpenLeaks thinks that secrecy is actually harmful, and Assange obviously thinks that secrecy within his own organization is beneficial because there are so many people going after them. So the dynamics of the battle between those two, I think, will be very interesting to watch. And I think if I had to make a bet, Assange would probably be better off emerging as a leader of the geek political movement that I've outlined at the very beginning. I think his charisma and his standing with the geek community will make him an ideal leader of this green-like movement that is emerging around the internet infrastructure. Again, that's my personal opinion, just based on observing WikiLeaks for several years. With regards to other clones that have emerged on the local level, we have seen websites like IndoLeaks appear in Indonesia, a website called Brussels Leaks appear in Brussels and in Belgium to focus on the European Union, a website called Balkans Leaks to focus on corruption in the Balkans and specifically Bulgaria. I think their future is a bit more uncertain, in part because I'm not sure that they would be able to sustain the pressure coming from power structures in the same way that WikiLeaks, the brand, can sustain it. I think the reason why WikiLeaks has been so resilient is because they managed very successfully to capture a significant share of the global attention. And they managed to get a lot of geeks and a lot of people who care about things like transparency and government secrecy to campaign on their behalf. And if needed, to set up mirrors for their websites and to offer all kinds of other services to make sure that they stay online. I'm not sure that if the Indonesian government or the Russian government or the Bulgarian government decide to go after the local leak sites, we'll see the same kind of anger expressed online. So I'm not sure how much space there is on the global public arena to basically protect those smaller sites that are emerging. The other thing to watch with regards to these numerous clones which are springing up all over the world is whether they actually manage to provide secure technology for uploading. Right? The key, again, as I've said, to WikiLeaks is its ability to protect its sources. Right? And that ability is not extremely sophisticated. It's technologically possible. I think every newspaper can actually build it very easily into their own website. And this is another reason why I'm not sure about the exact future of WikiLeaks itself, because right now they operate as an intermediary. Right? They operate as someone who stands in the middle between leakers and between the sources that publicize the leaks. And if anything, if the internet has taught us anything over the last 2 decades, is that the future of intermediaries is extremely uncertain. And I'm not sure that WikiLeaks currently provides the kind of intermediary services that are sustainable in the long term. The technology can be easily built on the websites of local newspapers and even NGOs. And the only superiority then, and the only innovation that WikiLeaks actually brings to the table is its network. Right? And again, we can argue whether a global entity like WikiLeaks will have a superior networks when it comes to journalists in Bulgaria or Bosnia or Belarus than a local NGO or local newspaper. Right? Many of the scandals that they're probably, and leaks that they're hoping to publicize will only have relevance in the local context. I mean, we cannot expect that all of the leaks will have the same ramifications as the publication of cables of the State Department. The publication of documents showing corruption in a local Bulgarian nuclear plant will only be of interest to Bulgarian media. Right? And then the question becomes whether WikiLeaks will actually have the cognitive power to process so much data and to establish a network powerful enough to actually take the best advantage of the data. And again, this is something that I'm not sure of. And it may be that if local newspapers and if local NGOs simply adopt a similar secure uploading technology, they'll actually be better off in terms of making sure that something happens after the leaks. That said, I think we should also remember that there are other elements to this WikiLeaks social movement. Some of you may have noticed the cyber attacks that were launched by WikiLeaks supporters on the websites of various companies, again, Amazon, PayPal, MasterCard. It was done by a group that calls itself Anonymous. And I think those cyber attacks may not have been always immoral. They were probably illegal in most cases. But the idea here is that WikiLeaks itself does not fully control who supports it at this point. And I think there are a lot of people who have emerged in the WikiLeaks orbit and in the sort of satellites of WikiLeaks, some of whom are not as trustworthy as WikiLeaks itself. And here I'm not so much talking about Anonymous, even though they have probably did some damage to WikiLeaks PR. I'm also talking about people who affiliate themselves with WikiLeaks in local contexts. You probably have heard a lot about the role that WikiLeaks may have played in the events in Tunisia last week, with some people assuming that and claiming that the cables that documented American attitudes towards Tunisia and that revealed that America is actually not as keen on supporting Ben Ali as commonly assumed may have abetted the protests. And I think this may be, unless we call it a WikiLeaks revolution and then overstate the role of WikiLeaks in the process, I think that this may be a fair conclusion to draw. On the other hand, if you look at a country like Belarus, where I come from, you'll see that the government itself managed to, I assume, get hold of the cables that were actually not published by WikiLeaks and that were not yet published by The Guardian and have them run in two Belarusian newspapers, one of them controlled by the government. And the cables actually revealed the fact that much of the democratic opposition in Belarus is supported by the US government, which helped the government to strengthen its case against the opposition, right? So, and the reason why the cables were released by the Belarusian media, supportive of the president, was because there is a guy who claims to be affiliated with WikiLeaks, whose name is Israel Shamir, who is basically supportive of the government in Belarus. So he went and met with one of the key leaders of the government, and I don't know what happened there, but the government got hold of the cables that made its own story and its own narrative of the political situation in the country look very plausible, right? So we have to remember that there will be, I think, cases like that repeating in the future unless WikiLeaks does a much better job of controlling who gets access to what cables. And this is the problem with managing a very huge network. The bigger your network, the harder it takes for you to screen all the nodes in the network. And you will eventually be ending up with cases like Israel Shamir, who is not the most trustworthy and responsible person out there, having the cables and then using them to their own political advantage, right? And this, I think, is something that we need to remember when we think about the ways in which WikiLeaks can scale. It will be very hard for it to scale and still vet all of the people it deals with. And this is why I think probably some kind of an open leaks model with a more decentralized approach and a more open approach may be more sustainable in the long run, if only because other people would be able to vet members of the network. So if I really have to bet on the best course of events for Assange and WikiLeaks, I think for Assange himself, it would probably be much better to affiliate himself with the emerging political movement, working to make internet more resilient and making it more likely to host entities like WikiLeaks in the future and provide more support to the transparency movement. But I just don't think that the WikiLeaks model as it exists now is scalable and that it may actually, that it will be able to operate as it has been operating as it scales and becomes more prominent and ubiquitous. I think I'll stop here and we'll have a discussion with Charlie and then we'll take some questions.
Right? Thanks very much. Thanks very much for that, Evgeny. I suspect there may be some people in the audience who are a bit confused.
Yes.
Because they came, not because of your talk, which is clear as a bell, but they may have come here to listen to the man that they read is the great critic of what the internet can do for freedom, the man who's written this book, Net Delusion, which says that many of these new forms of media are actually going to be used, as you've said, in Belarus, by authoritarian regimes. Why on earth do you think WikiLeaks is going to be any different?
Well, I mean, if they're confused, they should read the book. But I'm not claiming that the internet is bad for freedom or bad for democracy. All I'm saying is that the way in which we have conceptualized the power of the internet in authoritarian states and the way in which Western governments, and especially the American government, has chosen to embrace it and act on it is probably going to be harmful. It doesn't, I'm not saying that there is nothing to the internet that can open up authoritarian states or help mobilize people. All of that is possible, and I myself am working on making that happen by doing some work for George Soros's Open Society Institute. I mean, I'm very much involved in actually thinking about those models, and that's why I was tracking WikiLeaks from the very beginning, because I think there is definitely something that they add to the process. The reason why we should care about WikiLeaks as an internet phenomenon, I think, is because they do show and reveal a lot of vulnerabilities in the way in which internet operates right now. And the reason why I care so much about WikiLeaks is because even in the book, I think I made a strong argument that the current internet freedom agenda of the State Department and of the US government in general is completely deaf to their own domestic policy when it comes to internet control. So, my assumption always was that, NSA and FBI and others will be extremely unhappy about projects like WikiLeaks, and they will do everything to take it down, which more or less will then spoil the internet freedom agenda and make America look extremely hypocritical, which it did.
Yeah.
So I think making sure that the well-intentioned and the good intentions and the benign intentions of many people in America who do want to use the internet do not fall victim to their own domestic struggles with the internet, I think is a very important task.
And the case you make about the American hypocrisy of WikiLeaks is very strong. Do you think that, following up from your logic, though, about authoritarian regimes' ability to respond to these, that sort of one of the, and it may be the intention, perhaps the critics of Assange in the States are right, that the only people that, the only state or the only people that are going to suffer from this are going to be the Americans. They're the only people who are going to be held to account by WikiLeaks, because all the other really bad guys out there can ignore it. Or
well, I mean, I just don't buy that argument. I mean, again, if you look at what has happened in Tunisia, I mean, if you do buy into the theory that cables have played some role in it, it has actually been to America's favor. I mean, I do think they should go and give a medal to Julian Assange, who, if he did play a role in what happened in Tunisia. It's just that the State Department will never acknowledge that WikiLeaks has had any role in what happened there, because it just will be a domestic suicide for them, right, in the domestic context. But I think there is definitely an element of utopianism in WikiLeaks when they think that by publicizing corruption in Russia or China, they will be able to change the government there. I mean, but they are trying. It's not that they haven't been trying to release information about China or Russia. I mean, should they stop and focus on the US? No, I mean, I think they should continue pushing. But again, I think they should be aware of their own limitations. But I also don't think that it's right for Americans to think that WikiLeaks specifically goes after America. Because if you look at the kind of documents they released in the last 4 years, much of it had to do with Kenya, much of that had to do with Africa, much of that had to do, I think, even with Russia and their offshore bank accounts and whatnot. So I mean, I don't think it's a fair point. I mean, the fact that it's not having the same effect in Russia because America has a much stronger civil society is not a reason not to criticize America.
But isn't that the point? But isn't that what you're saying in net delusion, where people say, at least people are trying, but you say, well, it's not working yet in most of those authoritarian regimes. You're implying that, therefore, you shouldn't be trying.
I'm not implying that. I'm implying that only as far as it concerns the governments. I mean, NGOs can do whatever they want. Governments exist with taxpayers' money, and it's our responsibility to make sure that they invest that money appropriately. So, when someone in the State Department would make the same argument as Julian Assange, I would be extremely critical of it, because I pay taxes in America, right? But NGOs, it's game.
The NGO point's interesting because if we were to treat that talk as a kind of consultancy to WikiLeaks, you're suggesting, and I agree with you, I don't think the model, the existing model, which of course has changed, as you pointed out. WikiLeaks started as a very basic website for leaking stuff. Sorry, is the microphone not working well? WikiLeaks has changed. It started, as you said, as a very basic leaking site. It has now become a very sophisticated media organization. You're suggesting, though, that it should evolve quite rapidly, but in the direction of becoming an NGO. And when that happens, as you say, that may make it more sustainable, but it will also force it to be perhaps more responsible
Yes.
and possibly even more mainstream.
Yes.
So isn't that just going to spoil all the fun?
Oh, but that's exactly my argument. I mean, my argument is that I'm not sure that WikiLeaks itself and Assange and the people in his orbit actually want to become, the kind of boring, suit-wearing, people.
Human Rights Watch.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Who will be sitting by their desks and writing memos, right? I don't think that that's their vision for the future, and I'm not. They probably realize that as well. That's why I think, for them, for Assange and the people around him, I think the best way is really to go more towards the political end and see what it is they can do in politics. I mean, there is a huge number of young people supportive of the information freedom agenda in Scandinavia and increasingly more in Europe. I mean, there are 2 members of the Swedish Pirate Party in the European Parliament, one of whom I think is 23 years old. So I think it's along those lines. They see Assange and, the people in his movement contributing the most to stimulating more debate about the political nature of the internet. The fact that, currently, the rights holders and the Hollywood, the entertainment studios and everyone else has a much bigger say in how we shape our laws when it comes to file sharing, when it comes to how we shape our privacy legislation, and things like that, where I think they will be able to have a bigger say. And the other point I wanted to make is that while all of those new bottom-up projects aimed at reshaping internet infrastructure will probably succeed in bringing together a new way to host a website or conduct a payment or to maybe even get your new domain name, they will still not be able to fundamentally challenge the dominance of Google and Twitter and Facebook when it comes to communications. So WikiLeaks and others will still have to establish presence on Twitter and Facebook and comply with their draconian rules when it comes to hosting content. Yeah. And this is the only way to change those rules is to enter politics and to try to push those companies to agree to a common set of rules and regulations. You cannot do that technologically. You do need to enter and campaign and negotiate. You cannot just write a script or a program that will suddenly generate a more user-friendly environment on Facebook or Twitter.
And that's part of your, what you call, in the latter part of your book, the sort of cyber realist agenda, isn't it? That there is a battle to be won that has to be about realpolitik online. I just want to quickly switch back to the idea of WikiLeaks as a journalistic enterprise. This morning when we were talking about this in the seminar, one of the conclusion from one of the students was that objectivity, because of the internet, because of WikiLeaks, objectivity is dead, which is something I probably agree with, but I'm slightly sad as 20 years of trying to strive for that. And you're encouraging it to think of itself as political. Don't you think there is a problem of trust, of responsibility around something like WikiLeaks if it surrenders that claim to some sort of journalistic morality or ethics?
Sure, but again, I don't think that the idea of WikiLeaks as a political movement campaigning in parliaments and the idea of WikiLeaks as an entity that exists now is actually, I don't think those are compatible. They'll have to choose to be one or another. Right? And if they choose to enter politics, they'll probably have to abandon this space to projects like OpenLeaks and others. Right? So I don't think they will be able to do both. When it comes to whether they can continue doing what they're doing if they're political, I mean, they have chosen to be political the moment they released the collateral murder video in Iraq, which was edited and which had a title. Yeah. Right? The collateral murder title is something that they came up with, which was deliberate and which was probably the first time that they exercised editorial judgment. So I think I have my doubts that this is the right way to go. I mean, Human Rights Watch gives titles to their reports as well, right? They may not be as screaming as collateral murder is, but I think, if they do want to influence debate and have people believe in the kind of journalism they do and in the kind of data they release, I think they will need to be neutral. I mean, there is no way, I think, for them not to be neutral.
Don't you think that the contrary of that is, I mean, you're in a sense, as I said, you're urging them to be boring. In a way, what has been and whether whether you welcome WikiLeaks or decry it, that it's certainly a challenge to power, and it's a challenge to journalism and the power mainstream journalism has, because it doesn't conform to the restrictions or responsibilities that inhabit those normal worlds. But that is what is good about it.
Sure,
otherwise, you would not get that information.
Sure, but again, I think we have to look at what has happened. I mean, the fact that everything they do is political by default to me, right? So, but there is a question of the editorial neutrality, right, which is a different question. I think if you look at how they handle the cables, I don't see how they were political about it. They let The Guardian and others cherry-pick the cables they want to release. All of those cables first appeared on those websites. They didn't tinker with the titles of the cables. They didn't do anything that implied some kind of editorial preference to certain stories. The Guardian did. I'm sure there was a lot of political judgment there on behalf of the editors, and I'm sure there was a lot of political judgment in Der Spiegel and Le Monde and New York Times. But I don't see where WikiLeaks was being political. Of course, they did a lot of unconventional things. The way they behave on Twitter is probably not editorially neutral. They like to pick up fights, and and they like to imply and claim credit, for example, for Tunisia, probably more than they deserve on Twitter and elsewhere. So we have to separate, I think, the way they operate, how they handle the data, from how they present themselves to the public, from the way in which they try to rally up supporters to host their sites and whatnot. There is innovation on all levels there, but I think we definitely have to separate what they do as journalists from what they do as PR people, from what they do as computer geeks who want to stay online.